afternoon. We're now here in part 2 of the Apostolic Fathers, and specifically this afternoon focusing on Ignatius of Antioch. You will have your study notes there. If you look there on the cover page, page 1, there is a portrait of Ignatius, an iconographic portrait of Ignatius himself. In Greek, you read on the right side, Ignatius Theophoros, and I'll explain what that means as we work our way through the biography. One thing of note to point out there, if you looked on the iconographic portrait, in the bottom left and bottom right corner, you see these two little figures. Those are, hopefully if you can make those out, lions, painted in a very Greek style, as these artworks often were. And the reason for the inclusion of those lions will become more apparent as we work through the biography of this vitally important church father, Ignatius of Antioch. So, what we'll do, just give you a brief recap for anyone who wasn't here last week, as to who the Apostolic Fathers are. They are specifically those who were discipled and then kind of consecrated or ordained into ministry by an apostle. Okay, so they knew personally the original eyewitnesses to the life and death and resurrection of Christ himself. They were taught and learned and discipled from the proverbial horses' mouths, so they were. There were technically 5 of them, but there were 3 chief ones of whom we have much more information, and especially writings from those specific fathers, the 3 of them that have actually survived to our day. And those are Clement of Rome, who we covered in the last lesson, Ignatius of Antioch, who we're covering here today, and then in the next lesson, Polycarp of Smyrna. Clement himself, as we explained in the last lesson, was discipled and ordained by the Apostle Peter, and then the last 2, Ignatius and Polycarp, by the Apostle John, respectively. So, what I want to do is we're just going to work through the biography in the first portion of this afternoon's lesson, and then move into the writings of Ignatius, which are plentiful, but which I have, again, like we did in the last lesson with the first epistle of Clement to the Corinthians, provided an abridged breakdown of 3 particular areas that I would like to cover and share with you from the many writings that have actually survived of Ignatius. So, a biography of Ignatius. This, again, to just describe to you some of the specifics of the icon itself. The scroll there that he's holding in his right hand, on the left side of the image there, was done so and is a common attribute in imagery and in artwork of Ignatius, by virtue of the fact that we have no less than 7 letters written by Ignatius in the latter year of his life. We're going to explain what those are as we go through, of course, but we've been fortunate enough to have those letters preserved well down to us now over the course of 1900 years, in quite a good array, especially by virtue of how many of the church fathers in the centuries after him, so moving through the 2nd, 3rd, 4th and 5th centuries, write about Ignatius and quote things from Ignatius, because his works and his writings were quite theologically profound and deep even for the time, just like we saw elements of that with Clement's epistle. That was one epistle. This is 7 letters that we actually have. And so the element of writing and of a scroll there is present. And as explained at the top, we have, at the top of the explanation, you have 2 lions there by virtue of the fact that he was martyred by what's called the Natio ad Bestia. I'll explain that as we work through specifically. So if you have a look in your notes there in page 2. So Ignatius was born in the province of Syria, and there's hence why he is known as Ignatius of Antioch. For those who have been in going through our Bible study, we've encountered quite well now, certainly through chapters 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, the church at Antioch, which was the other major centre outside or beyond Jerusalem, the church of Jerusalem. In the province of Syria itself is a very important city. He's from Antioch, so he's born and raised in Antioch. Ethnically likely to have been Greek or Assyrian or a mixture of both. There's a lot of debate around that. His remains have been tested for DNA, and it's complex. There is a Syrian heritage, there is other Greek elements as well tied in there. But nonetheless, he's from the province of Syria, from Antioch, and hence why he's known as, of course, Ignatius of Antioch. He is also commonly referred to in church history as Theophoros. Okay? Theophoros, and I've transliterated that into English, so for those who don't actually read the Greek, you know what on earth it's saying. And simply translated, that name means bearing or carrying God. There's a variety of reasons as to why he's called that and why he's known by that name. A nickname, if you want to think of it as such. One is because he actually refers to himself that way. So he refers to himself as Theophoros. Theo being the word for God, phoros being carrying or bearing, like to carry out a task or to carry an object to this place or that place. Really what it's doing is as a nickname, so it were, is something that he writes about, especially as he heads to his martyrdom, which is the context in which his letters are written. Again, I'll talk about that more when we work our way through to the letters in the latter half. But nonetheless, his description of himself and his kind of self-attribution of Theophoros, and as a nickname or by name for himself, as well as what others called him anyway, really was a testimony to who he had sworn allegiance to. The fact that not necessarily that he was being carried or carried along by God, although that's true for any Christian, but rather that he bore the name and carried God's name with him, right? He had very clearly in his day, these early days and decades of the church, where Christianity is still completely illegal, is significantly persecuted, and now, especially by the time we get to the end of Ignatius's life, now has gone through a second major imperial persecution. The first one being what we call the Neronic persecution, or the persecution of Nero in the 60s AD, that decade, and then the second of which being the persecution of Diocletian, the Roman emperor which occurred, and that specific one occurred in the mid-90s. He's now lived through, well, both of those actually, but especially the recent one in his time, of that of Diocletian. And nonetheless, what you end up having is a man who testifies in his martyrdom to the fact that he's willing to die for the faith, that he's willing to bear and to carry the name of God publicly, even unto death in the face of brutal persecution as many had suffered. We know that he had converted to Christianity at a young age. What age, we're not sure. Because kind of as I explained last week, what comes with some of these earliest historical sources is not so much about all the nitty-gritty details of their life, but usually it's revolving around the important areas of their later years, especially when they're a bishop, right? So when they're a clergyman, as well as for a lot of them, almost all of them, their death, their martyrdom specifically. And of course you can understand hopefully why a lot is written about that. We assume that he's born sometime around when Clement was born. So Clement, who we looked at last week, was born in AD 35, and we assume that Ignatius was probably about the same age as well. We're not sure, we're not told at all when he was born, and so we don't know categorically. That's why at the top in the little breakdown it's kind of just question mark, because we don't actually know. But he's what we think a contemporary of Clement. And so later in his life, kind of in the latter half or the latter third, so it were, of the 1st century AD, he is appointed the Bishop of Antioch. Okay, and so is part of that church in which he himself had been converted into. Much of what is actually known about him, as I mentioned, comes from his martyrdom. There is debate as to what the date is, and I touched on that briefly last week. Whether it is AD 108 or AD 140. In my academic opinion, the preponderance of the evidence would suggest the earlier date, and I think the earlier date makes a bit more sense of some of the different historical sources. Nevertheless, whichever one of those two dates it happens to be, because there is conjecture, which happens sometimes when you're trying to nail down specific years in history. It's just the way that history as a subject works. That's the broad time frame. Okay, early 2nd century. At this point, obviously, all the apostles have passed away, including John. So the apostle John, his own apostle, his own teacher, passes away in AD 100. And so now we are very, very firmly, clearly, and obviously in the age after the apostles themselves. Okay, technically what we call the Apostolic age really for the most part ends in AD 70 because every apostle but John had been killed by this point. But technically it extends through to the AD 100, which is when the apostle John dies of natural causes. So he's martyred in Rome specifically, and he's, as I mentioned before, he's condemned to death by what was called in Latin the damnatio ad bestias, okay, which means damnation or punishment by beasts. Okay, relatively common form of execution. Like crucifixion, it was reserved for the worst of criminals. Okay, and involves quite literally being fed to the lions. That's where that phrase or that figure of speech comes from. Being fed to the lions comes from ancient Rome, and it comes from the literal sense, being fed to the lions. The Romans would use one of three animals in kind of most common to least common: lions, leopards, and bears. Okay. That had been gathered from around the empire, keeping in mind Rome has conquered the entire, especially by the time we get to his death in AD 108. This is under the rule of the Emperor Trajan, who rules from AD 97 to AD 117, so about 20 years there. 98 I should say, 98 to 117. And that's when the Roman Empire was at its greatest territorial extent. Right? They'd conquered all the way to Babylon by that point. And so they control all of what today is North Africa, Middle East, other such places where lions and leopards still exist in far greater and plentiful numbers than they do even today. And he is killed in that fashion. It was reserved for the worst of criminals, like crucifixion. Because the point really of damnatio ad bestia, or condemnation by beast, was the same kind of underlying principle as crucifixion. Crucifixion was, not just hypothetically, but literally excruciating. That's where that word comes from, the Latin crux, meaning cross. So excruciating as a word comes from how painful and horrific the death of a crucifixion was. It was also very public, hence why Christ's stone crucifixion was obviously very public. It would usually line the roads heading into a major city, and again was a very clear symbol to those entering into this given city that Rome had either built or conquered or whatever in between, that you will obey the law and order of Rome. Very public, very painful, very humiliating for the worst of criminals. Same goes for damnatio ad bestias, especially when you tie in the entertainment aspect of it. Damnatio ad bestias was perpetrated in all manner of theatres and amphitheatres and so on throughout the Roman Empire. Of course, probably most famously the Colosseum itself, where this occurred regularly. And you would either go up against beasts because you were a gladiator who was doing it voluntarily for fame and glory and wealth, or you would be facing it as a result of criminal trial. And Christians were allocated this form of death quite often, maybe even more often than crucifixion itself, some sources might even indicate. And there were four, and this is very important and helpful usually to understand, there were generally four reasons or four kind of legal or jurisprudential reasons or foundations that Rome would give for the execution of Christians in the empire. Okay, the first of which was condemning them for being guilty of high treason. Okay, what we call in Latin majestatis rei, right? There were two basic reasons for being guilty of high treason in the Christian context, as far as Rome was concerned, what we call collegium illicitatis, right, or just simply collegium illicitum, which means basically an illegal gathering, what we would call in the modern day probably an unlawful assembly. Okay, so gathering in a group that hadn't been approved by the state, capital S. The other reason is coetus nocturni, which basically means a night gathering. So gathering together at night. And those two things, unlawful assembly and night gathering, was always generally associated with a riot. And so they had that kind of legal ground for what they would try to then use. The second that would either be used on the side or would even be woven into that kind of legal ruling was that they, as in the Christians, refused to honour images and visages, statues, etc., of the emperor, either by libation or offering of incense. So a libation libation technically means a pouring or a sprinkling. So the way that would work is you would have, it was different at different times. It could be done in a fixed temple, but it would also be mobile, where Roman troops would take basically a vigil around that was actually mobile, could be moved throughout a city, for example. And you would be required, every Roman citizen, everyone else beyond that, would be required to come, and you'd wait in line, and you'd then come up to the visage, to the altar, so it was a makeshift mobile altar, and then you would, be it pour out some wine in honour of the emperor, sprinkle some incense or spices, other such things like this, as an offering to the gods in honour of the emperor, who also, keep in mind, which we've explained in going back all the way to our foundational lessons, was himself Divi Filius, the Son of God, which was often awarded posthumously, but again, we saw from those early lessons there are times where a number of those Roman emperors, especially early on, were being treated already as Divi Filius, the Son of God, before they had died, right? And that's where that kind of practice then becomes pretty prolific. Okay, so they refuse to do that for very obvious reasons. We offer sacrifice and offering to God alone, and so the refusal to do that was paramountly illegal. Okay. The Romans didn't care what gods you worshipped as long as you didn't interrupt the imperial cult. Okay, we explained that all the way at the back, and that's why, as you can see there from the second reason, that Christians were often tried as dissenters from the state gods. I've included the Greek word atheoi, right, which is where we get the word atheism from. Okay, so atheism, no theism, no God, because as far as the Roman state was concerned, as far as the Roman imperium was concerned, the Christians' denial in the existence of the pantheon or the plurality of gods was tantamount to atheism. They were saying they didn't exist. Okay, because again, the Romans didn't care what your local customary religion or gods were. The Christians could have waltzed through the empire without having to break a sweat if they worshipped Yahweh, right, the Trinity, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, if they worshipped Christ, and also just paid the regular normal homage every now and then to the imperial cult and to the Roman state deities. Okay, it would have been unbelievably easy, and we know that because everyone else got on that way as well. Okay, Rome didn't come down into Egypt when they conquered Egypt. Finally, in the days of first Julius Caesar and then Augustus, after bringing an end to Cleopatra and the Ptolemaic dynasty, they didn't come into Egypt and go, no, he's not called Horus, his name's Jupiter. You better call him Jupiter. No, they didn't care. Do you know what I mean? They didn't care. All they cared about was, nope, you can absolutely keep your own, just add ours. Do you understand? Including particularly and primarily the emperor, right, and the imperium as a whole. Because that's what kept peace. That's why Rome was such a successful force for peace and order, because they didn't roll into a place, conquer them, and then destroy their entire culture. The Romans were actually smart enough, and wily enough perhaps even, to realise that if we let them keep their culture, they won't revolt. Do you know what I mean? Don't annihilate everything they have. Absorb them into our thing and let them still keep their thing, and then we'll be fine, right? And that's why you have the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, okay? Peace that the world hadn't seen before, except it was peace built on falsehood. It wasn't true ultimate peace like that which has now come through Christianity as testified by history. It was a peace built on lies, right? Sacrilegi is the Latin term, which is where we get the word sacrilege from, okay? The sacrilege to dissent, to reject that any other gods were A, worthy of worship, or B, even actually gods in the capital G sense in the first place. Right? That rejection was the second reason. And so the third reason was, again, they were looked at as, in one sense, followers of kind of magic that was prohibited. There were Christians who were legitimately condemned and executed as magicians, okay? Falsely, but by virtue of how Rome understood or interpreted particularly at this time, particularly in the time of the apostles, how they understood and interpreted the various miraculous things that the apostles had been doing, healing someone who was sick or who was blind. And again, we've explained in our Bible study why that's going on. It's not a universal Christian thing, it was something for that time period, but we've explained why that was the case. As well as, and particularly, this was the big part, the condemnation as magus, right, or magician, comes really in how Rome understands what's going on in communion, in the Eucharist. So, for example, there were also attached to that legal condemnation as a magician, there was also this aspect of being tried and condemned for cannibalism as well, because of their understanding of what was meant by body and blood of Christ. And we'll get onto that when we go through our teaching here on the Eucharist, when we get into the letters, right, and we'll see what that means. But that was also tied in with that, okay? So you're used to seeing that word magi or magi, which is just the plural for magus, magician. You'll be recognising that word hopefully from the three magi. It's not really three, it's a group of them. They're not told how many. But the group of magicians from the east, Babylon, that come when Jesus was an infant. Okay, those were just simply Babylonian magicians. And that was the whole symbology of the nations coming to Christ and recognising him as the king of the nations, etc., etc. And the fourth reason was that they were confessors and therefore, advocates and disciples of an unauthorised religion. I explained to you earlier, just briefly, that just in brevity ago, that indeed the way in which Rome conquered was by allowing native peoples to keep their religion, to keep their customs, to keep all of those various things. That, by definition, the whole concept of allowing them to keep their native religion and customs inherently assumes legally authorising them to do so. Does that make sense? Christianity, by virtue of the fact that it denies and rejects the pantheon of and the plurality of these other gods, therefore necessarily determines that it was therefore going to be unauthorised. Okay, and so they were therefore engaging in religio illicita, right, or illegal religion. And this was according to basically what we call in history the 12 Tables, kind of like the constitutional foundation of Roman law, which goes all the way back even to the early days of the Republic. So as you can see, there's four broad reasons why they would be tried, condemned, and executed. All of them, again, if you actually see, if we were to sit here and just do an entire lesson on it, we could go through how the legal justification for these are completely A, immoral, and B, untrue. So Christians are not actually practicing magic, for example. Dissension from the state gods, again, is a question of who's actually right or wrong about the existence of said state gods, all these kind of various reasons. But as far as Rome's concerned, these were all legitimate according to Roman law. They were not being arbitrary. The question is, and this is something that we can take from even today, all of those reasons had a very solid and firm legal basis in Roman jurisprudence. Okay? So the question is not, is this legal or illegal? The real question is, are these laws morally right? Do you see the difference? Right? What went on, during COVID, as an obvious example, was completely legal except for like little obvious things here and there which they even violated their own laws. But the vast majority of that was working within a legal apparatus, going back to the Public Health Act 2010, that was perfectly legal as far as state jurisprudence is concerned and even federal. That's not the problem. The problem is, are these laws morally justifiable? And the consistent position of the scriptures and therefore of this church was no, because the state doesn't determine what right and wrong actually is. A higher authority does. Right? The subjective legislative whims of a given province, a given district, a given state, a nation, a kingdom, whatever it happens to be, are not and cannot be the ultimate authority. That is, by definition, tyranny. If there's nothing higher or above the state, you are living in a tyranny. Okay? You are living in a tyranny of man. There has to be a higher authority, and indeed the Christian position very clearly is that there is. That God is the one who determines what is right and wrong, that God is the lawgiver, and that his laws are just and righteous. So the question of whether this is legal or illegal in the Roman context isn't so much the question as it is, are these laws right? Are these laws righteous? And the answer, as far as Christians have testified for 2,000 years, even under heavy persecution and under facing torment and death and persecution and at certain points just flat out genocide, the answer is no. Okay? So moving back with Ignatius specifically, he is tried in Antioch, we think by a regional magistrate as opposed to the governor of Syria. I won't bore you with how we think that, but that's long story short. He is tried in court, is found guilty of a variety of crimes like those mentioned earlier, like we've just covered and mentioned earlier, and is then actually condemned to death. But interestingly, and it is interestingly historically, interestingly for him, he is actually shipped off to Rome to face execution. That's quite uncommon, not only by the history of persecution against Christians, but even just by general historical standards in the Roman Empire. Travelling someone from Antioch all the way halfway across the empire, essentially, to Rome, quite unusual. So we're not 100% sure why that happened. We have different hypotheses academically, but ultimately we're not quite sure. We just simply know that it happened. I think the broad theological point that can be drawn is that that was the providence of God, having him executed in the capital itself, because by virtue of that, Ignatius is one of the most well-known of the early church fathers. So you could try and string that obviously theologically and providentially there as well. But nonetheless, he is escorted by a group, or by a guard, essentially an escort of 10 Roman soldiers across Asia Minor, so places like that we've looked at in our Bible study, for example, Turkey, and for those who were there on Wednesday where we beginning Paul's second missionary journey, that map that you can that we had on Wednesday is what you should envision when you think of that, and deviated onto a number of different places across Asia Minor and then also in Greece. And so historically, as far as we can tell, we've kind of been able to pretty reasonably well reconstruct his journey from Antioch ultimately to Rome itself. And so the journey there looks essentially as this. He travels from Antioch to Asia Minor, so the western half of the western portion of what today is Turkey. We're unsure whether he went by land or sea, but nonetheless he arrives in Asia Minor one way or another. He's then taken to Smyrna, which is one of those major cities there on the west coast of modern-day Turkey, in the province of Asia, or the region of Asia Minor. One of the letters that Christ writes to the 7 churches of Asia Minor in Revelation chapter 2 and 3 is Smyrna, and of course Smyrna is where Polycarp is bishop. Okay, so we'll talk about him more next week, of course. And he travels to Smyrna via Philadelphia, which is again one of those other major cities and therefore churches that Christ writes to in chapters 2 and 3 of Revelation. Thirdly, he then moves up to Troas. You'll notice that from the Bible study on Wednesday for the two of you who are there. Troas being the ancient port city of Troy, the ancient city of Troy, which was then inland from Troas, and was where Paul and company, along with what we think is Luke in Acts chapter 16, then depart over to Macedonia. This is the same place, okay? So up to Troas, where he then boards a ship bound for Neapolis in Macedonia, right? Macedonia. So very similar trip to what Paul in his second missionary journey was taking, except in this case he is in Ignatius, goes via Asia, the province of Asia, whereas you may remember from Wednesday, they were not allowed to go into Asia. Okay, they had to go around it. Fourthly, he then passes through Philippi. This is where the letter to the Philippians is written in the New Testament, so the city of Philippi, which we will cover in coming weeks for our Bible study students. And then after this, from the port at Philippi up there in Macedonia, so northern Greece today, he then travels via again land or sea to Rome. We're not quite sure. I would suspect probably almost certainly via sea from that point, because the land trip is not off the beaten path, but it's kind of a Harvey World tour to get from Philippi to Rome. You have to go all the way up through Danubia, which is basically the Balkans, and then all the way around and down into the Italian peninsula. So it probably went by a sea. And so what's fascinating about Ignatius's martyrdom march, so where his trip to his death, was that he was given a lot of liberty to stop along the way, meet up with Christians, and not just like individually, but like go to church, partake in the liturgy. For one reason or another, his Roman escort of 10 soldiers were very liberal with what they allowed him to do. Obviously keeping him in chains and keeping him in custody, obviously. But he had many Christian visitors and messengers. This is how his letters got out. So this is how he was able to deliver his letters, because it wasn't some secret, spy movie with a dead drop in the middle of the night somewhere being hunted. It was, like Christians just came to him and he gave them the letter and they took it back to their church. He had visitors from the 6 different churches that he writes to, and the 7th one is specifically addressed to Polycarp himself, his contemporary. And so, these messengers then allow him obviously to be able to send those different letters to the churches, as I mentioned, to Polycarp also. It's fascinating. So in God's grace and in God's kind of providence, he allows, he orchestrates and allows for the Roman soldiers to then give him this kind of leeway, basically, a lot of wiggle room. It's very surprising, even again, just by general standards comparatively. He's on a very weird journey taken from Antioch to Rome. That's already a historical anomaly. And then given this much liberty, essentially, is also quite an anomaly. That's why the story of his martyrdom, A, is so famous, and B, is so kind of commonly talked about in the early church itself. Okay, and so that's essentially the basics of his biography. He's taken to Rome, is then condemned by the Damnatio ad Bestias, and he is then fed to, in this case, lions. We think it might have been the Colosseum. We don't have any hard, definitive proof of that. It's entirely within the realm of possibility that it was in the Colosseum. It could have been in another theatre or amphitheatre or arena in Rome. But one way or another, he was put to death in Rome itself. And the way that this worked, to give you kind of to bridge the gap historically and get you to understand hopefully what this looks like. This is part of an overall event, okay? So it's not like everyone's just coming here for this one thing. It basically works like, undercards and main cards in a boxing match where you have a famous, 2 famous fighters engaging in a bout. That's not the only fight that happens that night in the arena, right, or in the stadium, whatever the context is. There's an entire main card of 5 or 6 fights before it, and then even before that there's an undercard, which is basically for young fighters coming up who are not well known at all, but they're working their way up the ranks, and that might be 5 or 6 fights. So in the whole evening, even today in modern combat sports, there's 10 fights in the night, 12 fights. Not just everyone coming for a fight that might last 10 seconds if one of them knocks him out early. It's exactly the same with regards to theatre games, right, that of like the Colosseum, for example, in ancient Rome. Okay, it was an entire event that was a spectator sport. It was part spectator sport, part religious ceremony, part kind of imperial festival or parade. So it's a mix and a verge basically between, if trying to put it in a modern context, it's a mix between a sporting match, a religious ceremony of some kind, and like an Anzac Day parade. That's kind of what the Colosseum and any other arena, and there are hundreds of major arenas all around the world, thousands around the entire empire. That's what this was, okay? So in and around his death, there would have been gladiatorial matches, there would have been historical reenactments, especially if it was in the Colosseum. There definitely probably would have been one where they can literally reenact naval battles. They would literally take out the flooring and then put in water, and you'd have actual ships in the Colosseum. If it was in the Colosseum, it's entirely possible the emperor was present, or at least someone representing the emperor was present. all these kinds of things, okay? And then you would have, in and amongst gladiatorial matches, public executions. And that could be a variety of things. That could be death by gladiators, so you could actually have to fight a proper professional gladiator, be they slave or free, wouldn't really matter. Most gladiators were slaves, but some were free men, and they chose to remain gladiators because that's just who they were warriors. And so you just, Joe Schmo Numpty, was thrown a wooden sword or thrown some other delinquent instrument, and then here fight this battle-hardened veteran gladiator who's going to take your head off. There was many other such ways. They did crucifixions in the Colosseum as far as I can recall, but the big one, and the one that drew the biggest crowds, was always death by beast, and being fed to lions, leopards, bears, etc. And so that's why back on your title page you have commonly associated with Ignatius is a lion or two lions, and so he was devoured by lions, which usually, most times, fortunately with big cats, is quite quick. Big cats tend to go for the throat, and they even have in their canines, ironically, in their two major fangs of a teeth, they actually have sensory outlets in their teeth that can actually feel where the vein is in the body of their prey. A gruesome death, and I'm not doing it just to be macabre or to give you unnecessary details. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to show you what Ignatius and a lot of the early church fathers went through willingly, and not just willingly, but gladly. One thing, it's not what we're covering here this morning, or so this afternoon, but one thing that is really apparent from Ignatius' writings is that he is so willingly accepting his death. He has zero fear. In fact, the very opposite. He is basically, what's the word one might use? More than just glad. He's thankful. He's actually thankful would probably be an appropriate description. He's thankful to God that he has the opportunity in front of the capital of the empire itself, the eternal city of Rome, to demonstrate his fidelity and faithfulness to Christ, and that he will triumph through death into victory, and that death is not the end for him. So he writes about that across many of his letters. It's hardly a letter that he doesn't talk about it, about the fact that he's not just willingly accepting his death, he's actually bravely and faithfully and gladly accepting of it, and views it as an opportunity that he is thankful to God for, to actually undergo that. It's not too dissimilar to what we kind of see as a phenomenon among, even today, among Christians who are persecuted. Again, like, Christianity is far and away the most persecuted religion in the world. Well over 80% of people, even in the modern day, who die specifically because of their religion, so in other words, they're killed for it, are Christian. Overwhelming majority. The overwhelming majority of those who face persecution of any kind, right, imprisonment, torture, all manner of social things, the vast majority who face that are again Christians. Christianity has always been the most persecuted religion, and even still is to this day. But what you find among persecuted brothers and sisters is a very similar attitude. They're not sitting around moping, saying, "Woe is me." They're not depressed. They're not disheartened and saddened and, "Oh, why do I have to go through this?" And they actually, it's the opposite reaction, right? They pendulum swing the other way. They take it as affirming of the truthfulness of their faith. There'd be no reason to persecute them so heavily if they were just some other false philosophy, because who cares, right? That's the same thing with what Rome did, right? Rome had no problem incorporating all the various different cultural and religious ideas, because none of them impacted Rome's position. As soon as Christianity comes along, now it's a problem, because now you had the truth of God being testified to the Romans, that there is but one God. There is one creator above all other gods, lowercase g. And that was problematic, right? Everything was fine until the Christians came along. And so you find this attitude as well among persecuted Christians, even in our own day or in our own time. Okay? And so what we'll do here is we'll transition into these 7 epistles. Again, we're not going to go through all of them. We're just going to cover certain select portions, and you find those there on page 3 in total. But it's helpful to at least list off what the 7 epistles themselves are. Okay, so in order, there's the epistle to the Ephesians. So this is the church in Ephesus, of course, to whom Paul writes as well. The epistle to the Magnesians. So Magnesia is a city, port city, south of Ephesus. The epistle to the Trallians, which again is also in that region of the coastal portion just south and inland of Ephesus. His epistle to the Romans is obviously a letter he writes to the Church of Rome when he gets to Rome. And so that's also a place where, of course, we find in the New Testament the Apostle Paul writes to the Romans. So if you were to talk about 2, you need to dissect which one that is. This is the Ignatian epistle to the Romans. The epistle to the Philadelphians. So Philadelphia, a city inland in Asia Minor. It's one of the 7 churches of Asia Minor, as we call them, from the book of Revelation. And so a vibrant Christian community there, and you can read about God's words to them in Revelation chapter 2 and 3. The epistle to the Smyrnaeans. So this is the city of Smyrna, which is up the coast from Ephesus. It's another, even in its day, it was a very important coastal city and port city, a major city on the coast. And still is, it's called Izmir today. Izmir is just the Turkish translation of Smyrna, and it's also still an important kind of coastal port city in modern day Turkey. And Smyrna is where Polycarp is bishop. Okay, and so he also writes an individual letter specifically to Polycarp as bishop of Smyrna. So what you have is you have six epistles or 6 letters to 6 particular churches in Asia Minor and plus Rome, and then you also have one specifically to his contemporary and friend Polycarp as well. Okay, so what we're going to do is, you can see there on page 3 of your study notes, just want to cover 3 brief sections, right? One on ecclesiology, one on Christology, and then 2 quotations specifically on the Eucharist, right? So communion itself, and I'll elaborate and talk about those as we go through. So you'll see there the first quotation coming from chapter 2 of his epistle to the Trallians, wherein Ignatius says the following: regarding ecclesiology, which is, in other words, the church, and particularly things like church hierarchy or the structure of the church. This is what kind of things that fall into ecclesiology. He says, quote, "In like manner, let everyone respect the deacons as they would respect Jesus Christ, and just as they respect the bishop as a type of father, and the presbyters as a council of God and college of apostles. Without these, it cannot be called a church." I referenced this last week. We didn't go into great depth because I was saving it more for today. But we referenced in the first epistle of Clement to the Corinthians that he talks about giving an admonition to the presbyters and to the deacons. Recalling from last week what the issue was, the problem was the fact that in Corinth, a group, a kind of cabal of young guys, had basically overthrown most, if not all, of the elders, presbyters, where that word comes from presbyter, in the church at Corinth. So they were in dire straits and had basically a revolution going on, unfortunately. You have the identification of 2 offices. Office says, so ES, not ERS, but ES, that of presbyter and that of deacon. Okay, presbyter comes from the Greek word, it's a transliteration, presbyteros, which is that word which will often be translated as elder in most English Bibles. Okay, but presbyter is just the historic transliteration, presbyteros, presbyter. It's where we get the word Presbyterian, so like Presbyterian churches, for example. I'll explain more about how that works in a minute. You also here have obviously the deacons, that's mentioned first up, which Clement himself covers. But what Ignatius does is, and he doesn't do it just here in his letter to the Trallians, he does it elsewhere, he does it very consistently throughout his writings. He identifies a specific word, bishop, which again you'll be familiar with from the New Testament, especially if you read some of the older historic translations like the King James, for example, which translates the Greek word episkopos as bishop, which is correct 100%. So Bishop is just, again, like presbyter, a transliteration, so not translation, transliteration from episkopos. So episkopos became episkop, bishop. See how that works? But what he's doing here is he actually is identifying a bishop as not necessarily something strictly different, but as something that is categorically different, okay, from a presbyter, i.e. an elder or a pastor, same thing. And what's interesting about this, especially for, like myself, who is obviously as a clergyman, or those who are studying on the issue of ecclesiology, so the structure and nature of the church, is how church leadership has been understood and hierarchy has been understood throughout church history. These kind of texts become interesting. For the majority of church history, including up to this day, the overwhelming majority of Christian traditions use what's called an episcopal model. Okay, episcopal, which comes from that word episkopos, or bishop. Okay, so that's where you will have identifiable as deacons, presbyters or ministers, same thing, elders, pastors, priests, those are all the same word functionally, and then bishop. Okay, so a bishop of a given city, right? If you take the Anglicans, for example, you have the Archbishop of Sydney, for example, or the Archbishop of Melbourne or Brisbane. That's been the majority model throughout church history. Obviously, as Baptists, we follow what's called a congregational model, which is kind of opposite end of the spectrum, which maintains the dual office of deacon, presbyter. And again, presbyter has been known by many different names, be it obviously presbyter, be it elder, which is the translation of that word, pastor, which is a different word but is kind of incorporated into that definition, etc., etc. But nevertheless still has a much flatter church hierarchy, so it were. It's not as stratified, and just maintains the dual office, and each individual local congregation is that given church, okay, as opposed to the Church of Sydney or the Church of Melbourne, the Church of Antioch, the Church of Jerusalem, Rome, pick a place. The middle of that is the third of those historic options, which is Presbyterianism, hence where that comes from with the word presbyter, which is not like the Congregationalists, so Baptist, is not quite like, although there's elements that are shared, it's not quite like the Episcopalians, so groups like Anglicans or Lutherans, but it's somewhere in the middle, right? It comes down from the Reformed tradition, usually men like Calvin, John Knox, literally John Knox in Scotland, who is the founder of the Church of Scotland, which is the kind of historic root of Presbyterianism. And it employs similar hierarchical structures to Episcopalianism, but without a specific designation between presbyter and bishop, right? That's the divergence from that side. And it shares some commonality with Congregationalism, being that local churches maintain an element of authority, but it's elements of authority within a synod, okay, so within a group of churches. Okay. These are the three broad Christian traditions of church governance or ecclesiology. Okay? Congregationalism, Baptists; Presbyterianism, Presbyterians, right, or continental Reformed churches, like Reformed churches by name, and then Episcopalianism, so Anglicans, vast majority of Lutherans, and other such denominations. Okay. There's been much debate throughout history, and often, especially since the Reformation, when we were trying to work these issues out, when we were going back to the early church sources really for the first time in about 1,000 years, on a proper kind of concerted level, on a deep and profound level, and trying to work out, had we in the West, this is where the debate's occurring historically 500 years ago, had we in the West gone awry with church structure as well? All right, because obviously a big problem 500 years ago was the level of quite literally universal, i.e. Catholic, supremacy that the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, was claiming. Right? That's not something that they've fixed yet, but one longs for the day when they will, because the fundamental claim 500 years ago about the papacy, and it's still standing and it's still correct, is that no single, even under an episcopal model, where you have a distinction between presbyter and bishop, and again I'll come back to that, what that means specifically, because it's not like a clear difference, but even among an episcopal model like the Roman Church has, or like all the Eastern churches has, like even Orthodoxy, for example, Oriental Orthodoxy as well. Even in that system of model of church governance, no single bishop from a single city is ever given any indication in the New Testament or anywhere in the early church of being supreme over all the other cities. Does that make sense? Okay. As much as Rome tries to retroactively reinvent history going back in time from today, the one thing that they can't end up overcoming is this thing called facts and the truth. Because there is precisely zero indication in the early church that it was universally accepted among all the different churches and even the major what we call the Apostolic Sees, S-E-E, so Jerusalem, Alexandria, Antioch, Constantinople and Rome, that even among those groups, that it was ever accepted that the Bishop of Rome was the universal bishop over all the other bishops. There's zero. You can talk to Roman Catholic apologists till the cows come home, they'll tell you it is, and then you press them on the issue and you end up finding that old Mother Hubbard's cupboard is rather empty, because there is no such thing. But what we have here in Ignatius is a clear, at least literary distinction between presbyter, so i.e. bishop, elder, pastor, etc., and a bishop. Now, when you read the full context of Ignatius' writings, you find out that it's not that the bishop is like this kind of super race of church leader, although he has great esteem for the bishops. It's rather that the bishops are presbyters, okay, but that they are then, as a church grows to the point of a whole city, like Antioch, which is where he's from, there is then a single bishop that has been appointed by his time, like himself, to actually have oversight and be able to coordinate all the churches in a city. Okay. See, when we think of a church as Congregationalists, as Baptists, we think of our single little congregation. This is Katoomba Baptist Church, for example, right? And we then read, and it's a pitfall of Congregationalism, I'll admit, but what we do is we then read into the New Testament about the Church of Jerusalem or the Church of Antioch. And we picture in our head a group of people sitting in a building kind of like we are, and that's the Church of Corinth, without failing to realise that the Church of Jerusalem is tens of thousands of people by the time you get to AD 100. Like it's bigger than almost every American church today. It's a big number, but it doesn't take a rock scientist to figure out they're not just gathering in someone's cupboard in some house somewhere. Okay, there's churches, i.e. local congregations, all over the city. Right? Not in Jerusalem by this point, right? Because by this point they've all evacuated Jerusalem. But that same church which began in Jerusalem, which is now residing in Pella, from which they fled during the destruction of Jerusalem, is thousands, if not tens of thousands of people. Antioch is tens of thousands of people. And so what an elder looks like in that context is, yes, in one specific congregation, but there's congregations all over the city that are referred to as the Church of Antioch. Does that make sense? And so it's in that context that then quite clearly, because this is early 2nd century, and then we have more confirmation of this by the time you get to the mid to late 2nd century. By the 2nd century, there was kind of a necessary pragmatic development, is the generous way of putting it, of having one of those presbyters be utilised as a specific term from the New Testament, episkopos, bishop, not like crowned above, although it is in one sense like he has oversight. That's what the word episkopos means, overseer. But he has oversight as a presbyter that's almost kind of first among equals. That's a common historic term in the church. It's called in Latin primus inter pares, first among equals. But still among equals. He's not some completely different category. So to the point, and you get a good reflection of this for anyone who wants to learn more, in Anglicanism, every bishop starts off as a minister, like a local church minister, like the minister at St Hilda's or the minister at this church or that church. And then they are eventually appointed as bishop, but they don't just go from nothing straight to bishop. And in fact, even in Anglicanism, you actually almost always go through as a deacon first. So you go deacon, then presbyter, then bishop. The reason why I wanted to point this out is, A, we're seeing this kind of distinction already taking place. And the way that the Reformers view it, especially even John Calvin, who himself held to what we would broadly call a Presbyterian model of ecclesiology. Calvin himself didn't have this rigid, hard line, there's only one way of doing it type of attitude. Basically his view, and it's one with which I agree, not that he was the only one who said it, but was kind of the most famous, his view essentially was that this was a necessary cultural custom to develop in those big cities with lots of churches that needed to all be managed and coordinated, that can't just be singular, isolated things. And this is kind of one of the unfortunate sides on the congregational issue, is that whilst Congregationalists like Baptists have been very hard in rejecting those models, there's hardly a Baptist church today, more than 50 to 100 people, that doesn't have a senior pastor leading associate pastors. So it's the exact same concept, we're just pretending that we're not doing it. Do you see the problem? So I'm not what you would call, I'm just explaining my position on it, I'm not what one would call an ecclesiological absolutist. That sounds like a mouthful. What it just simply means is there's only one specific model of church leadership that is explicitly spelled out in the New Testament, and that anything else beyond that is a violation. So I don't hold to that. A number of the Reformers didn't either, by the way, in case you're just thinking that Daniel's gone off on the road less travelled. Apart from the fact that the church, by the time you get to the late 2nd century, or not even really, it's kind of like the mid to early 2nd century, but definitely by the late 2nd century, the Episcopalian model, so deacons, presbyters, and then a single presbyter who leads the presbyters called a bishop, that model is universal by the 2nd century, right? So what you'll kind of have to basically do, and it's universal all the way up until the Reformation, where some Reformed traditions move away from that, a number of them keep it, like I said, Anglicanism and Lutheranism being the obvious examples, but there are other ones as well. If you hold to a kind of absolutist opinion that basically one is right but the other two must be wrong, in whichever one you pick, you kind of end up having to conclude, I'm just being honest about history here, you basically have to conclude that the church universally went off the rails in terms of church leadership or church governance in the 2nd century, and was completely off the rails and in violation of Scripture for basically the next 1,300 years. And I'm not terribly sure you want to try and defend that position, okay? Because I don't actually think, because again, the bishop, even in these days, as throughout is still a presbyter. He's just a leader among the presbyters. And again, that being smart, Congregationalists who reject that theoretically then turn around and appoint a senior pastor among associate pastors, right? Or senior pastor and elders, which are a different thing. The board, board or a council of elders, and then there's the senior pastor who's different from that. We end up doing the same thing, unfortunately, because I'm not actually an ecclesiological absolutist. I think all of these models can work biblically. That's why we don't have this blindingly obvious, here's the really specific way in which this works in church leadership as far as the New Testament is concerned. I think it is legitimately contextually developed. When you go to a place that Christianity's never been, like when the gospel was first getting into southern Africa, so sub-Saharan Africa, or into South America or into parts of Asia, you've got one poor missionary or one or two poor missionaries going out and planting a church. Well, they clearly don't have, it's not even what they don't have the available options for a full board of presbyters or elders and then a bishop to help lead them. That's not the contextual need. But as that church grows and grows and grows, and you've got multiple congregations, the needs will also grow. So a number of the Reformers regarded this as an area of liberty within a certain confine. Does that make sense? Yeah? Because you have, especially the history side, you basically have to conclude, if you are an absolutist, that the church went off the rails all of literally like a couple of decades after the apostles, and then was completely in error for 1,300 years until John Knox and the Presbyterians arrived from Scotland to save the day. That's basically what you have to believe, okay? And I don't think it's justifiable from history, and I don't even think it's necessary biblically, okay? Those three different models are all legitimate models, I would argue, within the confines of the Scripture and in the traditions of church history. So, moving to that second portion on Christology. So this comes from chapter 7 This comes from chapter 7 of the epistle to the Ephesians that he writes. So, on Christology, Ignatius says as follows, quote, "But our physician is the only true God, the very begotten and unapproachable, the Lord of all, the Father and begetter of the only begotten Son. We also have as a physician the Lord our God, Jesus the Christ, the only begotten Son and Word, before time began, but who afterwards became also man of Mary the Virgin. For the Word was made flesh. Yep. Being incorporeal, he was in the body. Being impassible, he was in a passible body. Being immortal, he was in a mortal body. Being life, he became subject to corruption, that he might free our souls from death and corruption, and heal them, and might restore them to health when they were diseased with ungodliness and with wicked lusts." Apart from the very deep, profound rhetoric employed here by Ignatius, reasons why we want to point this out and why it's so important to read these kind of things is because we are finding here in and around the early 2nd century, the very first decade thereof, right, in and around 107-ish AD, a highly developed, well understood Christology. Okay, so Christology referring to the nature and person of who Jesus is, okay? Describing that he is indeed both fully God and fully man, not in that specific wording, that's going to take a couple of hundred years to get to by the time we get to the Council of Nicaea and Constantinople in the 4th century. But you already see the theological underpinnings of it, okay? By virtue of him being incorporeal, in other words, not physical, because God is spirit, and that's immaterial by nature. Being incorporeal, he was in the body. So the spiritual and the physical united. When Bible study on Wednesday, we explained it, we were having a whole discussion about the fact that the world must be more than just the material world, by virtue of the fact that we all have a mind, okay, not just the organ of the brain, but the mind itself which controls all the things that I'm doing. That is immaterial subject, in other words, spirit, acting upon the material, right? And so this concept of material and immaterial is found in and around the year 100 AD, right after the conclusion of the New Testament and of the Apostles. Okay, this is demonstrating again that this was not a later development, right? As some enemies of the church have so tried to argue over the last kind of 100 to 200 years, that no, the divinity of Jesus, that was late. That was invented by the Council of Nicaea 300 years later, or Constantine, the Roman emperor. He's the one who came up with this doctrine and blah blah. All this does is it shoots this idea out of the water. You have early historical testimony to what the New Testament is very clearly saying. And it's interesting to consider because, again, the canon of the New Testament hasn't been completely formulated yet at this at this particular time period, I should say. So what they used to say is no one was coming to church with their leather-back binded Bibles and their with every single book available to them. Different churches had different books available to them because this thing grows. Letters have to be copied, manuscripts made, transmitted and transported not by the luxury of instantaneous email, but rather by messengers and ancient postmen, so they were, travelling across land and sea and trying not to get it destroyed or stolen by bandits or anything else that could happen in between. So the fact that we have Ignatius here giving this kind of developed understanding of Christology is an incredible testimony to us as to the truthfulness, the veracity of what the New Testament describes Jesus as being. Okay, God in the flesh, right? Then the third section is on the Eucharist. Having then seen or read that from chapter 7 of his epistle to the Ephesians on Christology, that's the light in which we can then understand what we then read on the Eucharist. So from chapter 7 as well but from this time the epistle to the Romans, Here's what he writes concerning communion itself. Quote, "I have no taste for corruptible food, nor for the pleasures of this life. I desire the bread of God, which is the flesh of Jesus Christ, who was the seed of David. And for drink, I desire his blood, which is love incorruptible." Now, I'll bookend it in, obviously, with the second quote. But what I want to do is I want to show you here an important understanding of what on earth communion actually is. I'm going to set this up for you as best I kind of can. There are two broad understandings, as we zoom out to the broadest level, the two broad categorical understandings of what communion is really ultimately is twofold. It can subdivide into a bunch of different things, but it's ultimately two. It's a binary equation in that sense, okay? One is what we call the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, okay? And I'll explain what that means in a minute. The other is symbolic memorialism, okay? So real presence versus symbolic memorialism. What those at their broadest possible sense mean is symbolic memorialism, a view that was held by Zwingli, one of the reformers. It's a view that is the absolutely common position, not universal, but most common position for denominations like Baptist, which is that, as the name suggests, all that is going on in communion is that we are simply using two physical elements, right, bread, wine, to symbolically represent that which happened 2,000 years ago, right, the crucifixion, and that it is essentially akin to any kind of other memorialistic service like an Anzac Day. The common example I use for us, which is an obvious one, is like an Anzac Day, okay? When we go to a given cenotaph, right, that's a tomb of the fallen soldier or the unknown warrior, for example, down in Sydney, etc., the actual soldiers aren't buried there. There's nothing particularly going on in the actual memorial cenotaph itself. We're just simply remembering something from the past, okay? That's called symbolic memorialism. So those two things are purely symbols and there's nothing else, yeah? The other category is what I mentioned, that real presence. Now, what that has meant has been different things depending on different times in church history. But real presence, or the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, explains that there is, of course, obviously a symbolic element, right? Because the cup is representing the blood, the bread representing the body, which were broken and spilt respectively on the cross. But that it's not only symbolic, there is also something else legitimately spiritual through the power of the Holy Spirit when people indwelt by the Holy Spirit actually partake in it, okay? Those two broad categories have had different ways that they've broken down. So, for example, in the Reformation, a big problem with what the Reformers were looking at when it came to the doctrine of it, as in of communion, was a doctrine that had arisen only in the last couple of hundred years from their perspective, so in other words, in the late medieval period, which we call transubstantiation, okay? Which was that me, right, a clergyman, a priest, would consecrate and sanctify the elements with very specific words of institution, and that my priestly grace, with God working through me, would then change the substance of the elements. We can't go into what substance means because it's an Aristotelian category that goes back to Thomas Aquinas and then all the way back to Aristotle. That's not for today. The problem is it can be, and still can be, shown to be erroneous. But the Reformers didn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Zwingli kind of did, but everyone else did not. They didn't reject the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist or in communion. They didn't just swing over and go, no, there's nothing going on here, it's just us doing an Anzac Day type of service. But that rather, there isn't a change in the substance of the elements, but rather God's grace of sanctification in the life of a Christian is administered through the sacraments. So baptism and, of course, ongoing communion. I've preached on this before, so if you want to have a look at it, you can go back on our YouTube channel or on our church website and find the sermon I did on communion about this time last year or early last year, whenever it was, on communion, where I explain those kind of differences. Okay, this was the position taken by Calvin and many of the reformers, John Knox, Bucer, Melanchthon, etc. It's the historic reform position. Even those, again, Anglicans, Lutherans, are all still in the category of real presence, not the symbolic memorialism. One thing that's worth pointing out, which is the whole point of this church history stuff, is that, and it's rare we can say this, by the way, because the early church hardly had a universal opinion on almost anything. One of the very few universal positions that the early church unanimously agreed on was the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. Okay. We have zero evidence of anyone at any point writing, teaching, believing, or anything else in between the symbolic memorial perspective. Okay. And as someone who does church history and who teaches it, that alone, before I even get into the ways that we talk about in the New Testament, because you can very clearly demonstrate from the New Testament the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist as opposed to the purely symbolic. The fact that zero people in the early church believed it is kind of a death blow in one sense, right? This is why history is important, because we're not taking church history as, that's the infallible rule, right? I'm the first person to ardently proclaim sola scriptura, which is the idea that the scriptures alone are the sole, ultimate, infallible source because they are the words of God. But church history doesn't get thrown out or dispelled, because that's what people do today, unfortunately. Church history is then meant to be acting as the kind of guardrails. We go, okay, I want to know what the scriptures mean. Why don't I see how the church has worked this out and understood this throughout history, right? And when you look at the early church, and that also goes by extension the medieval church, and by extension the majority of the Reformed churches, the real presence of Christ is the answer, especially in the early church and the medieval church. There is zero hint. The first time that someone kind of produces a memorialist view is really not until the 11th/12th century. Okay? And for the first 500 to 1,000 years of the church, real presence is what's understood. That's why you get this kind of verbiage of, I desire the bread of God, which is the flesh of Christ. He was the seed of David. And for drink, I desire his blood. Okay? He's not just talking purely symbolically, because Ignatius's argument, along with the other church fathers, is that Christ was not purely talking on a symbolic level. Right? That's why he said, for example, when he said, this is my body and this is my blood, not at the Last Supper, but even before that, he said this is a hard teaching. Because he's not just talking symbolically. There is actual grace administered through that by the Holy Spirit. That he doesn't just do it arbitrarily, but rather that he does it through means like he does with other things, right? We are brought into the church, not just because we snap our fingers and ta-da, this is now a Christian. Instead, we do what? We baptize them. See what I mean? We bring them into the church through baptism, okay? And we connect that to salvation, right? By virtue of being brought into the church, right? That's why Peter says, for example, baptism now saves you. At the exact same level, or in the same way, God administers his grace, the ongoing sanctifying grace of God that we talk about plenty, not just arbitrarily, kind of just in some way that no one can really identify, but through the other sacrament, communion. And that we commune with Christ, not physically, because he's not physically here, but spiritually so, because again, we're not atheists. We don't just believe the material world is all that there is. We also rightfully identify the necessary, logical, spiritual reality. Real presence, okay? I've taught on that before. Again, you can go back and look at that sermon, but that's why he then says, this one works its way pretty quickly, right? That last one there. Take note of those, this is from chapter 6 of his epistle to the Smyrnaeans. Take note of those who hold heterodox opinions on the grace of Jesus Christ, which has come to us. And so heterodox meaning as opposed to orthodox, so the opposite, so hetero meaning other, okay? So heterodox opinions on the grace of Jesus Christ, which has come to us, and see how contrary their opinions are to the mind of God. They abstain from the Eucharist, so they don't take communion, and from prayer, because they do not confess that the Eucharist is the flesh of our Saviour Jesus Christ, flesh which suffered for our sins, and which that Father, in his goodness, raised up again. This kind of language is replete throughout the rest of what he writes. It's also then consistently spoken of in the same terms by the other church fathers, and as we go through, we'll keep identifying that too. This is a good foundation for understanding those distinctions. You zoom out to the broadest level, what are the two broad views in history? real presence of Christ, symbolic memorialism, early church, I can categorically tell you there's zero evidence of anyone holding to symbolic memorialism. So again, it's kind of like what we mentioned with ecclesiology. You kind of basically have to go, well, if I believe in symbolic memorialism, the church was like dead wrong from 5 minutes after the apostles dying. They went off the track with Clement and Ignatius and Polycarp and Irenaeus and all those early guys, and then they didn't come back online until Zwingli and the Reformation. You basically have to believe, again, that 5 minutes after the apostles are gone, the whole thing goes off the rails, universally. It just doesn't work. If there's no evidence of it in the early church, guess what the answer is? Not that. Do you know what I mean? It's a fairly simple thing. And so I've taught before on the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist from the scriptures in that sermon, and you can go back and listen to it. It's just called, I think it's maybe called The Nature of Communion. I can't remember what I titled it, but anyway, you'd find it on our YouTube channel when you go back a ways, or on the church website. Okay, so that ends the lesson, and that's where we'll put a pin in his plethora of writings, 7 entire epistles. Again, you can find them online very easily. But the lessons that we should learn from Ignatius are this. He is a man who greatly valued God, who was a prolific leader in the Church of Antioch as Bishop of Antioch. He stabilized the church. It wasn't part of of today's lesson, but there was actually a problem in Antioch during his time, in and around his time, where they were on the verge of a schism, so the church actually breaking up into 2 different churches. And Irenaeus, as bishop, along with his other fellow presbyters, actually managed to reconcile those 2 groups and reunite the Church of Antioch. Okay, so he had a long-lasting effect on the unity of the church. And if he spends his majority of his time doing one thing in his letters, it's talking about unity. Okay, it didn't come up here today because that would require us going through all the letters. But the one consistent theme of his throughout his letters is that of unity. So the church at Philadelphia, Smyrna, Ephesus, etc., blah, blah, he's exhorting them, maintain the unity in Christ, maintain unity in Christ, maintain unity in Christ. Not arbitrarily, not putting up with those who have heterodox opinions, because he just told you what he thought of those who had with heterodox opinions, but unity in the truth. Unity in the truth. He was big on unity. And the second thing is that, again, by virtue of that, by virtue of his faith, his commitment, his loyalty, he faithfully went forth to his death, gladly and rejoicingly. He stared down lions, literally, and said, "Bring it on," so it were. And he went to his death, not with fear or trembling or trepidation, but with the very righteous and fiery courage of a lion. And so really what this was a lion himself being fed to the lions. This was a lion of Christ. This was one who follows the Lion of the tribe of Judah, who himself died as a man of honour, bravery, and just abounding courage, who looked death in the face with zero fear, with zero trepidation, knowing that he would indeed pass through the veil of death and not come to an end, but rather would be more alive than ever before. Right? Ignatius is an incredible and prolific example of the faith and the loyalty that Christ imbues in his people, and we should pray and thank God for men like Ignatius and all those saints before us who have faced death bravely and faithfully. So, therein ends today's lesson. Any final questions before we finish up? Yep.
So the Romans invented multiculturalism?
The Romans invented multiculturalism? They weren't the only. The empires before them certainly had. The Persians were masters of multiculturalism. Persia, again, Rome didn't get that idea themselves. The reason why Persia was able to build the largest empire the world had ever seen, more than 40% larger than even Rome itself, just not without conquering the same geographical regions as Rome did. The reason why Persia was able to so successfully conquer and to maintain its empire for about 200 years before Alexander the Great put an end to that was the fact that they would go forth, and when they conquered, again, they wouldn't annihilate or completely subjugate and completely try to convert their conquered peoples, like the Babylonians, like the Medes, etc., the Assyrians and so on, the Jews. They would instead allow them to keep their cultural customs. And you see that play out when Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Achaemenid Empire, aka the Persian Empire, conquers Media, and then his successor in Darius conquers Babylon and releases the Jews back to Jerusalem, obviously, in the land of Canaan, right? And then even after them, the command from Artaxerxes II, Darius' successor, comes down to rebuild the temple. All of that is them giving full room and legal right and assent for the Jews to go and build all their stuff and rebuild Jerusalem, because they were smart. Because they were smart. Now, part of that is also providential, because there's exactly two people in history that have ever been referred to as Mashiach. And one's obviously Christ, and the second person's not David, by the way, which is interesting. The second person's actually Cyrus the Great, who, it's only one reference, and it's to be taken in context. But Isaiah refers to him when Isaiah, right, the 8th century prophet BC, when he prophesies of Cyrus's birth by name, 150 years before Cyrus is even born, he calls him, as in this case God through Isaiah calls him Cyrus my Messiah, or Cyrus my anointed. Okay, that's what the word Messiah means. Because he was going to use Cyrus, and by extension the successive emperors after him, to bring judgment on the Babylonians who had conquered the Jews in Jerusalem, who destroyed Jerusalem and then took them all off into slavery. Right? That's not how the kingdom of God works. It doesn't just incorporate your things. What it does is it now gives a new unifying thing that's not some earthly king. It's actually the King of Kings. Yeah. So, any other questions? Good-o. All right. Thank you very much, everyone. See you next time.